What happens when a 9-month pregnant wife, armed with ironclad divorce papers, and the federal police crashes her billionaire husband's romantic yacht getaway with his mistress? This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a tale of epic betrayal, meticulous revenge, and the day a powerful man learned that the woman he underestimated was the one who would orchestrate his spectacular downfall. We're about to set sail into the heart of a tempest on the shimmering Amalfi Coast, where the turquoise water is about to be stained with secrets and lies. Stay tuned as we expose the moment a gilded empire built on deceit came crashing down in the most public and humiliating way possible. The sun over the Amalfi Coast was a painter's dream, a molten gold orb melting into a sky of impossible blue. Below the Mediterranean Sea was a dazzling blanket of turquoise and sapphire, so clear you could see the shadows of fish darting deep beneath the surface. It was upon this perfect canvas that the Serenity floated a monument to obscene wealth and refined power. She wasn't merely a yacht. She was a 300-foot feedship masterpiece, a floating palace of polished teak, gleaming chrome and glass that seemed to merge with the water itself. Her owner, Julian Croft, stood on the aft deck, a man who mirrored his vessel sleek, powerful, and impeccably polished. Julian was a titan of the financial world, a hedge fund manager who played with markets the way a god might play with mortals. He hadn't just been born into money. He had taken his family's considerable fortune and multiplied it with a ferocity that terrified his rivals. He had a predator's smile eyes, the color of old money, and a charisma so potent it could bend reality to his will. At 42, he believed himself invincible, a modern-day king, surveying his kingdom from the deck of his warship. Draped over a plush sun lounger near him was Sienna, a woman whose beauty was as breathtaking as the Positano coastline clinging to the cliffs in the distance. At 24, she was a confection of sun-kissed skin, honey-blonde hair, and a figure that had launched 1,000 Instagram campaigns. She was an influencer, a model, a brand ambassador, a professional beauty, whose currency was desire. She held a flute of Dom Perignon Rosé, the pale pink liquid catching the afternoon light. "Is it always this perfect, Jewel?" she murmured, her voice a sultry purr. She shifted the tiny triangles of her designer bikini, doing little to conceal her ambitions. "Or did you arrange the sunset just for me?" Julian chuckled, a low, confident sound that rumbled in his chest. He moved to her side, his shadow falling over her. "For us, darling, I only deal in perfection." He ran a hand down her arm, his touch proprietary. "You're enjoying the serenity. She's overwhelming." Sienna breathed, tilting her head back to look at him. "I've been on yachts before. Sponsored trips to Dubai, a weekend thing, with a music producer in Miami. But this..." She gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, the infinity pool that seemed to spill into the ocean, the discreet crew members who anticipated every need before it was voiced. "This is different. This is power." "It's a tool," Julian corrected gently, though her observation pleased him. "A place to escape the noise, the endless demands." He conveniently left out that the primary demand he was escaping was from his 9 months pregnant wife, Annalise. Annalise with her quiet strength, her intelligent eyes, and her inconveniently timed pregnancy. He had told her he was closing a delicate merger in Zurich. A necessary trip, he'd said, his voice laced with feigned regret. He'd kissed her belly, a theatrical gesture for a child he wasn't sure he wanted, and promised to be back in time for her final doctor's appointment. Annalise. The name felt like a phantom limb on the yacht, an unwelcome ghost at their decadent feast. She was his wife, the elegant and stable partner who looked so good at charity galas and on the society pages. An art historian from a good but not wealthy family, she was the anchor that made his high-flying life socially acceptable. But anchors could also be chains. Lately, her quiet observations had started to feel like judgments, her questions a little too perceptive. Her pregnancy, which should have been a crowning achievement, felt like a closing cage. Sienna, on the other hand, was the opposite of a cage. She was a breath of fresh, unencumbered air. She didn't care about his portfolio's ethical implications or the late hours he kept. She cared about the sparkle of the diamond bracelet he'd gifted her, the number of likes on the photos she'd artfully tagged from the yacht, and the promise of a future where she would be the one at the galas. Another bottle? I think Julian declared, snapping his fingers. A steward clad in crisp white materialized instantly. And bring the beluga, the good stuff. As the steward retreated, Sienna sat up, her eyes gleaming. You know, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I was thinking about us, about the future. Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the part of the script he disliked, the inevitable pivot from carefree fun to expectations. The future is a beautiful sunny day, just like this one. But the nights are long, Jules, she countered, refusing to be dismissed. And they can be lonely. What happens when this trip is over? You go back to her. To the wife. She said the word wife, as if it were a disease. Annalise and I have an arrangement, he said coolly. A well-worn lie that even he was starting to find thin. It's complicated. Uncomplicate it. Sienna urged her hand now on his thigh, her nails tracing patterns on the fabric of his linen trousers. She has to know, deep down. Women always know. Why drag it out? Imagine the life we could have. No secrets, just this, always. Julian looked out at the horizon. The thought was tempting. A clean slate, a life with a woman who was a beautiful accessory, not a partner who saw the cracks in his facade. He was tired of the double life, the careful partitioning of his world. Maybe Sienna was right. Maybe it was time to uncomplicate things. He could give Annalise a generous settlement, more than generous. She and the baby would be set for life. She was a practical woman. She would see the logic. He was so lost in the intoxicating fantasy of his own freedom that he didn't immediately register the second vessel. It wasn't one of the small, charming fishing boats that dotted the coast, nor was it a tourist-packed ferry. This was a different kind of boat, a sleek, dark-hulled river, fast and purposeful, cutting through the calm water with an unnerving precision. It was heading directly for them. Sienna noticed it first. Looks like we have visitors. Did you invite more friends? Julian frowned. He hadn't. He valued his privacy above all else. No one was supposed to know he was here. He'd used a shell corporation to book the mooring and filed a false itinerary for the Serenity. He watched as the Reaver slowed its engines, dropping to a low growl as it maneuvered alongside his yacht. The crew of the Serenity looked equally perplexed, their professional calm ruffled. On the deck of the Reaver, 3 figures came into view. 2 were men in the crisp dark blue uniforms of the Guardia di Finanza, the Italian financial police. Their faces were impassive, their presence an immediate and jarring note of authority. Between them stood a woman. Julian's blood ran cold. The ocean seemed to tilt the golden sun dimming. The woman was his wife, Annalise. She was not tearful or distraught. Her face was a mask of serene, cold fury. Her 9-month pregnant belly was prominent beneath a simple but elegant white dress. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes, which he had always praised for their warmth, were now like chips of ice. In one hand, she clutched a thick leather portfolio. Julian felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child, who had been caught in a serious transgression, the icy grip of pure, unadulterated fear. Sienna let out a small, confused gasp, pulling a silk robe around herself. "Jules, who is that? Is that?" Annalise's gaze swept over the deck, taking in the scene. The champagne, the caviar, the half-naked mistress with a chilling lack of surprise, as if she were merely confirming data she already possessed. Her eyes finally landed on her husband, and in that moment, Julian Croft, the invincible Titan, knew that his perfectly curated world was about to be torn apart at the seams. The storm had arrived, and it had a name: Annalise. The air on the deck of the Serenity grew thick and heavy, the joyful pop of the champagne cork now a distant mocking echo. The yacht's crew, trained to handle any situation with discreet efficiency, seemed paralyzed, caught between their duty to their employer and the undeniable authority of the uniformed officers now preparing to board. A member of the Serenity's crew lowered a boarding ladder, his movements stiff and uncertain. Annalise ascended first, her steps measured and steady, despite her advanced pregnancy. She moved with a purpose that was terrifying to behold. She did not stumble. She did not waver. She carried herself not like a scorned wife, but like a queen about to pronounce a sentence. The two officers of the Guardia di Finanza followed her, their polished boots landing on the pristine teak deck with an ominous thud. Julian finally found his voice, forcing it into a semblance of his usual commanding tone. "Annalise, what in God's name is this? What are you doing here? You should be in New York." Annalise didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flickered from Julian to Sienna, who was now standing clutching her robe like a shield. It was a brief, dismissive glance, the kind one might give to a piece of furniture that was about to be repossessed. Then her eyes locked back onto Julian's. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. It was the lack of hysteria that struck him the hardest. There was no screaming, no sobbing, just a terrifying, glacial composure. "I believe we have some things to discuss, and some paperwork to sign." She opened the leather portfolio. From it, she produced a thick stack of documents bound in blue. She held them out to him. "These," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity across the silent deck, "are divorce papers. They cite infidelity among other things. I think you'll find the evidence attached to be quite thorough." Julian stared at the papers as if they were a venomous snake. His face, usually a mask of charming confidence, cycled through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and then a rising tide of pure rage. "You're insane," he snarled, taking a step forward. "You track me down here pregnant to pull a stunt like this. We will discuss this in private. Now tell your companions to leave my yacht." One of the officers, a stern-faced man with a thick moustache and the rank of Maresciallo, stepped forward. "Signor Croft," he said, in heavily accented but clear English. "We are not her companions. We are officers of the Guardia di Finanza. We are here on official business." Sienna, who had been frozen in place, finally spoke. "Jules, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are these people?" "Stay out of this, Sienna." Julian snapped, not even looking at her. His entire focus was on Annalise, this stranger who wore his wife's face. "This is a private matter." "It stopped being a private matter, Julian," Annalise said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "When you started using our joint accounts and assets to fund your extracurricular activities." She gestured vaguely towards Sienna. "And it became a state matter when you started using those same channels to hide your money." A new, more profound dread began to seep into Julian's bones, colder and deeper than the fear of divorce. "What are you talking about? Hide my money?" "That's a ridiculous accusation." The Maresciallo spoke again, his tone brooking no argument. "Signor Croft, we have a warrant to search this vessel and to seize certain electronic devices and documents. This warrant is issued based on a formal complaint and preliminary evidence suggesting significant financial crimes, including tax evasion and money laundering." Julian felt as if the deck had been ripped out from under him. Tax evasion, money laundering. These were not just words. They were specters that haunted men like him, the only real threats to their power. But he was careful. He was meticulous. He had the best lawyers and accountants in the world. How could this be happening? He looked at Annalise, a horrific realization dawning in his eyes. Her calm, her control, the presence of the financial police. It was all connected. "You," he whispered the single word, dripping with venomous accusation. "You did this." Annalise met his gaze without flinching. "I did," she confirmed, a flicker of something, not triumph, but grim satisfaction in her eyes. "You seem to have forgotten that my father was a forensic accountant before he retired. He taught me that numbers never lie. And your numbers, Julian, have been telling a fascinating story for the past 3 years." The portfolio in her hand held more than just divorce papers. It held his life's secrets. Julian felt his world spin. Annalise, his quiet, unassuming wife, the art historian he thought was content arranging flowers and planning dinner parties, had been poring over his finances. She had been collecting evidence. The trips he'd coded as business development in Monaco, the art purchases from obscure galleries that were really shell companies, the wire transfers to untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands. He thought he had hidden it all behind a labyrinth of corporate complexity. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. He had seen her as part of the scenery of his life, not as a player in the game. "Why?" He choked out the question, raw with disbelief. Annalise's composure finally cracked just for a second. A wave of genuine pain washed over her face before being suppressed by sheer force of will. "Why?" She repeated, her voice trembling slightly before steadying. "You want to know why? Look at her, Julian." She finally pointed a finger directly at Sienna, who flinched as if struck. "You stood in a church and made vows to me. You put your hand on my belly and swore you loved our child. And all the while you were spending our money, our future on this, on disposable women and a life built on lies." She took a deep breath. "I mourned our marriage for months, Julian. I cried myself to sleep in the beautiful empty mansion you bought for me. And then one day I realized that tears wouldn't protect my child. My child deserves a father who is present and honest, or he deserves a fortune built on something other than his father's crimes. Since you couldn't be the former, I decided to secure the latter." She turned to the Maresciallo. "Officer, the main server for the yacht's financial and communication logs is in the captain's study. His personal laptop, which he uses for his private hedge fund transactions, is likely in the master suite." I would also suggest you look for a specific piece of art, a small sculpture by a forged artist he calls Ricci. It was purchased for 7 figures through a gallery in Geneva that doesn't actually exist. The payment was routed through 3 different shell corporations. That was the loose thread I pulled on. The Maresciallo nodded, impressed by her precision. He gestured to his partner. Begin the search. Secure all laptops, phones, and paper records. Confine Signor Croft to the main salon. Julian was dumbfounded. He was being given orders on his own yacht. His sanctuary had become his prison. "You can't do this," he roared, lunging not at the officers, but at Annalise. "You treacherous bitch! You've ruined me!" Before he could take 2 steps, the second officer, younger and faster, intercepted him, grabbing his arm in a powerful grip. Julian struggled for a moment, his expensive Tom Ford shirt straining at the seams before realizing the futility of it. The fight went out of him, replaced by a chilling stillness. The king had been checkmated. Annalise watched, her expression unreadable. She turned her attention back to the divorce papers, which had fallen to the deck in the scuffle. She picked them up, smoothed them out, and placed them firmly on an outdoor dining table. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours, Julian," she said, her voice once again devoid of emotion. "Assuming, of course, that you can still afford one." With that final devastating blow, she turned her back on him, on Sienna, on the life they had shared. She walked towards the boarding ladder, her posture erect, her white dress a beacon against the darkening blue of the sea. She had come, she had conquered, and now she was leaving the wreckage for him to drown in. As she descended back to the Riva, leaving Julian in the custody of the police on the deck of his seized vessel, the setting sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world's most beautiful coastline into a sudden, unforgiving twilight. As the sleek Riva carrying Annalise sliced through the turquoise water, shrinking into a defiant speck against the grandeur of the Amalfi coastline, a vacuum of sound and energy formed on the deck of the Serenity. It was as if she had taken all the air with her. The pop of the champagne cork, the seductive music that had been playing softly, the easy laughter, all were now phantom echoes in a place that had transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene. Julian stood rooted to the polished teak, the divorce papers Annalise had placed on the table, fluttering mockingly in the sea breeze. His world, once a solid, predictable structure built on the foundations of his own invincibility, had begun to liquefy. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the kind one experiences when looking down from a great height, only he was looking up at the ruins of his own life. The sun felt too bright, the air too thin. He was the king of this vessel, the master of his universe. Yet the quiet authority with which the Guardia di Finanza officers moved through his space rendered him a ghost. One officer spoke quietly into his radio in Italian, his words sharp and clinical. The other began a methodical sweep of the deck, his eyes missing nothing. They ignored Julian, their indifference a more profound insult than any aggression could have been. He was no longer a player to be contended with. He was simply the subject of an investigation, an object to be managed. His gaze fell on Sienna. She was a statue carved from fear, still clutching the silk robe to her throat, as if it could ward off the disaster unfolding around her. The sun-kissed glow was gone from her skin, replaced by a pallid, clammy sheen. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted from the officers to Julian, searching for an explanation, an escape route, a sign that the powerful man she had attached herself to was about to fix this. Julian's survival instincts, honed in the cutthroat world of high finance, finally clawed their way through the fog of his shock. He needed a plan. He needed control. "Sienna," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "My phone. The black one. Get it and call Alex Vanguard. His number is pinned. Tell him I have a situation here. A domestic dispute that's gotten out of hand. Tell him to get on a plane." Sienna stared at him, her lips slightly parted. The command, the expectation that she would be his functional assistant in the middle of this chaos, seemed to baffle her. "Alex Vanguard. Your lawyer, Jules. What is happening?" They said money laundering." She whispered the words as if they were a curse that might be invoked by speaking them aloud. "It's nonsense," Julian snapped, his voice cracking with a rage born of pure terror. "It's my wife. She's unwell, unstable. It's a revenge fantasy. Alex will shut this down in a matter of hours. Now get the phone." But she didn't move. Her feet, clad in delicate golden sandals, seemed fused to the deck. The self-preservation instinct, far more potent than any loyalty to him, was screaming at her. A domestic dispute didn't come with federal police and warrants. Making that call felt like deliberately shackling herself to him. She wasn't just his girlfriend anymore. She'd be an accessory, a co-conspirator. My things are inside," she stammered, taking a half-step back. It was a retreat, and they both knew it. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. He saw the calculation in her terrified face the moment she mentally weighed the benefits of staying with him against the risks. He saw himself losing her, too. "Sienna," he warned, the word a low growl. "Don't you dare walk away from me." But his threats were empty. The power had shifted. He was no longer the protector, the benefactor. He was the liability. With a final frightened glance, she turned and fled into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the yacht, leaving him utterly alone with the silent judging officers. The origins of this perfectly executed demolition did not begin with a private investigator or a dramatic confrontation. It began almost a year prior in the sterile silence of their Fifth Avenue triplex, a home so vast and pristine it felt more like a private museum than a place where people lived. Julian was away, supposedly, at a tech conference in Seattle. Annalise, unable to sleep, was paying bills online, a mundane chore that grounded her in the otherwise abstract reality of their immense wealth. And there it was, a single anomalous line item on a joint credit card statement he rarely used. A charge for over 5,000 euros. Not from Seattle, but from the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. It was for the Sweet Princess Grace, a room she knew was one of the most romantic and opulent in the world. It was a clumsy, arrogant mistake, the kind made by a man who had stopped bothering to cover his tracks with any real diligence. For another woman, it might have been the spark that lit a firestorm of tears and accusations. For Annalise, it was a key to a door she hadn't even realized was locked. Her father, a quiet, brilliant man who had spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, had taught her one fundamental truth. Everything leaves a trace. People lie, but numbers don't. Numbers tell a story. Her investigation began that night. Fueled by a cold, quiet dread, she went into Julian's magnificent home office, a room she rarely entered. It was his domain, a temple of dark wood, leather, and technology. She sat in his oversized chair, which still held the faint scent of his expensive cologne, and typed in a password she hadn't used in years, Archie 1998. The name of the golden retriever he'd had as a teenager. A sentimental detail he'd shared during their courtship a piece of himself he'd long since forgotten giving her. The computer unlocked. For hours she navigated through folders of market analyses and corporate reports, a world she had always been content to leave to him. Then she found it. A partition on the hard drive, encrypted and disguised as family archives. Using a decryption key she'd found in a notebook in his desk drawer, the serial number of his first Porsche, another relic of a past he thought was buried. She opened the partition. It was like staring into the abyss. There, laid out in meticulously organized spreadsheets and ledgers, was Julian's real life. It was a second set of books that detailed not a business, but a shadow empire built on deceit. She saw the network of shell corporations with absurd, bland names like Global Asset Holdings and Triton Investment Group, registered in Panama, the Caymans, the British Virgin Islands. She saw the wire transfers coded as consulting fees and acquisitions that flowed into these entities and then disappeared. And she saw the art. Julian had always presented his collecting as a passion, a shared interest between them. But on these ledgers, the art was just another currency. He would buy a sculpture from a gallery in Geneva for $2 million, funneling the money through 3 shell companies, then have the same piece appraised a year later for $5 million, and borrow against it, creating clean cash from thin air. She found the file on the forged artist he'd invented, Marco Ricci. There were fake auction records, forged provenance documents. It was a breathtakingly audacious fraud. Then she found the folder labeled G&E, Gifts and Entertainment. It was a log of his infidelities, recorded with the cold precision of an accountant. Names, dates, cities, and amounts. A diamond necklace for a model in Milan. Rent paid on a condo for a starlet in LA. And the most recent entries, thousands of dollars spent on Sienna R, including first-class flights, designer clothes, and hotel suites. She was not the first. She was just the latest and most expensive. The woman who walked out of that office as the sun rose over Central Park was not the same one who had entered. The grief was a physical force, a crushing weight on her chest. Their marriage, their life, everything she believed in, was a sham. She cried for 3 days, a silent, hollowed-out weeping in a house that felt like a mausoleum. The turning point came on the 4th day. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she felt it a distinct fluttering kick from within her womb. It was a message from a future that had nothing to do with Julian's lies. It was her child, a real innocent life that deserved more than a legacy of crime and a father who was a phantom. In that moment, the grief didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened into a diamond-sharp resolve. She would not be a victim. She would not take a settlement and disappear quietly. Tears wouldn't protect her child, but Julian's own money, legally and righteously seized, would. She would not just divorce him. She would dismantle him. She would build a firewall of truth around her child, and she would use the bricks of his own deceit to do it. Annalise became a woman possessed by a singular purpose. She used her own inheritance to hire a discreet forensic accounting firm in Zurich. On a secure video call, she presented her findings to 3 stone-faced Swiss accountants who were accustomed to dealing with the world's wealthiest criminals. They were stunned not just by the scale of the fraud, but by the meticulous, undeniable evidence the art historian wife had gathered. They confirmed her findings and helped her chart the labyrinthine flow of money. She learned the Serenity was his crown jewel, an undeclared asset worth over $100 million registered to a shell corporation in Malta. When she found out through a stray email that he was taking Sienna there to the very symbol of his stolen wealth, she knew she had her stage. The poetic justice was too perfect to ignore. Through a top-tier Italian law firm, she presented her case file to the Guardia di Finanza. It was so complete, so irrefutable that they fast-tracked the warrant. Back in the present on the rocking deck of the yacht, chaos was erupting. Sienna, having failed to get any reassurance from Julian, had made a decision. She emerged from the interior, no longer in her bikini and robe, but dressed in jeans and a sweater. She clutched her oversized, expensive handbag like a life raft, her eyes wild with panic. "I'm leaving," she announced, her voice high and strained. "My driver is waiting at the marina in Positano. I have nothing to do with this." She made a frantic move toward the boarding ladder, but the Maresciallo stepped into her path, a calm, immovable object. "Signorina, I'm afraid that is not possible," he said, his tone polite but firm. "You are a material witness. We have some questions for you." "Witness, I don't know anything," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm a model. He invited me on a trip, that's all." The second officer approached them, holding the small, beautiful jade statuette they'd found while searching her cabin. It looked elegant and harmless. "Maresciallo, we found this in the Signorina's handbag. It corresponds to an item on the list of flagged purchases." Sienna looked at the statue, then back at the officer, her face a mask of confusion. "It's a gift. Julian gave it to me last week. It's just a present." The Maresciallo took the statuette, weighing it in his hand. He looked at Sienna, and for the first time a hint of pity entered his eyes. "Signorina Rossi," he said, using her full name and making it sound like a verdict. "This present was purchased for 200,000 euros through a Panamanian corporation called Viridian Trading, which our preliminary investigation shows is a front for laundering art sale proceeds. It is a key piece of physical evidence. You were found in possession of it, attempting to leave the vessel." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am afraid this complicates your position significantly. You are no longer just a witness." The meaning behind his carefully chosen words crashed down on Sienna with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She wasn't a victim. In the eyes of the law, she was an accomplice, caught red-handed with the spoils of a crime. Her face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of the glamorous influencer, dissolving to reveal the terrified young woman beneath. A gut-wrenching sob escaped her lips as she sank onto a nearby deck chair, her head in her hands. Julian watched the entire exchange, a cold, bitter laugh catching in his throat. The irony was suffocating. His wife had betrayed him with her intellect. His mistress had unwittingly implicated herself with her greed. Everyone had turned on him. Everyone had abandoned him. He was utterly, completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he had believed to be perfect. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not the end. This was just the beginning of his descent into hell. The night fell upon the Amalfi coast not as a gentle blanket, but as a suffocating shroud. A real storm, which had been a distant threat on the horizon, had now muscled its way in, turning the idyllic sea into a violent, churning cauldron of black water and white-capped fury. Rain began to fall first, as hesitant drops, then as a relentless, driving torrent that lashed against the panoramic windows of the main salon. Distant flashes of lightning bleached the sky for a moment, revealing the grotesque dance of the waves, before plunging the world back into a profound, roaring darkness. The Serenity. The pinnacle of maritime engineering groaned under the assault, its gentle rocking replaced by jarring lurches that spoke of the sea's raw power Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The yacht's warm ambient lighting had been supplemented by the harsh, functional glare of portable lamps brought aboard by the Guardia di Finanza. The officers moved with a quiet, unnerving professionalism, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the cream and mahogany opulence of the interior. They were ghosts at a feast, systematically cataloguing the evidence of a life that had only hours ago seemed unimpeachable. Every tagged laptop, every bagged phone, every sealed document was another nail in the coffin of Julian Croft's world. Julian was a tiger in a glass cage. He had been pacing the length of the salon for what felt like an eternity, the plush Aubusson carpet doing nothing to soften the harsh impact of his steps. The physical confinement was galling, but it was the loss of control that was eating him alive. For his entire adult life, the world had bent to his will. Markets rose and fell on his command. People answered his calls. Doors opened. Problems vanished. Now he was a spectator to his own dismantling, forced to watch as men with government salaries picked apart his image with meticulous, indifferent hands. His rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of dread. He was trapped, and the architect of his prison was the one person he had never considered a threat. In a guest cabin on the lower deck, Sienna was experiencing her own private hell. The questioning by the Maresciallo had been deceptively polite, yet utterly terrifying. He hadn't accused her of anything directly. He had simply asked questions. When did she meet Signor Croft? What was the nature of their relationship? Had she travelled with him before? Did she know his wife? Was she aware of his business dealings? And then the question about the gifts. He had laid out photos of the Cartier bracelet, the handbags, and finally the small jade statuette they had found in her purse. "This is a lovely piece, Signorina," the officer had said, his voice neutral. Signor Croft was very generous. "Do you know where he acquired it?" Sienna had just shaken her head, her throat tight with fear. The intricate web of shell corporations and laundered money the officer briefly alluded to was a language she didn't speak. She understood brands followers and flattering angles. She did not understand wire fraud or international asset tracing. She was a swimmer who had been happily paddling in the sunlit shallows only to be dragged into the crushing, lightless deep. The officer's final words before leaving her in the cabin echoed in her mind. "You will need to remain on the vessel. You are a material witness, and your possession of this item complicates your position." Complicates your position. The sterile legal phrase was a death sentence to the life she had been building. Her name was now tied to Julian's. The scandal would be her scandal. The headlines would feature her face. She would not be remembered as a successful influencer, but as a billionaire's mistress, a foolish girl caught holding the stolen goods. A desperate primal anger began to bubble up through her terror. An anger at Julian. He had done this to her. He had lied, wrapping his sordid secrets in a glittering package of romance and promises. He had used her, and now he was going to discard her. The fantasy she had nurtured of being the one to finally win him, of becoming Mrs. Croft, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the ugly reality underneath. She wasn't his partner. She was his collateral damage. She needed to see him. She needed to force him to acknowledge what he had done to her. It was this desperate, furious need that propelled her from the cabin and up the stairs to the main salon. When the door opened, Julian looked up, his face a mask of irritation. He saw her not as a fellow victim, but as another complication, another buzzing insect distracting him from the central problem of his own survival. "Julian!" Sienna said, her voice a raw quiver. "I need to talk to you." He waved a dismissive hand. "I have nothing to say to you, Sienna. You should be trying to figure out how to explain that statue to them, not bothering me." The coldness of his tone, the immediate shift of blame, snapped the last thread of her composure. "Don't you dare," she shot back, stepping fully into the room. The Maresciallo, standing discreetly near the main exit, watched them both, his face impassive. "Don't you dare try to pin this on me. You lied to me about everything. Your whole life is a lie. You told me she was an ex-wife in all but name, a business arrangement. You told me it was over." Julian let out a bitter scoff, turning to face her fully. The hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a familiar, cruel arrogance. "And you were so innocent in all of this. The naive little girl, you never once stopped to ask where the money for the 5-star hotels and the private jets came from. Did you? You just held out your perfectly manicured hand and smiled for the camera. You saw exactly what you wanted to see. So don't you dare pretend you're some virginal victim in all of this." His words were like slaps to the face, each one landing with brutal accuracy. He was right in a way. She had chosen not to see. She had willingly participated in the fantasy because the reality of her own life was so much less glamorous. But his hypocrisy was breathtaking. "I have something to tell you, Julian," she said, her voice suddenly low, her hands instinctively wrapping around her flat stomach in a gesture of primal protection. The storm outside unleashed a furious gust of wind that rattled the yacht's frame. "Something that changes everything." Julian rolled his eyes. The master of drama now impatient with anyone else's. "What now? Have you suddenly remembered you're a secret agent working for my rivals? Spare me the melodrama. My life is already a 3-act tragedy." Sienna took a shaky breath, the air thick with unspoken words. The decision to say it here now in front of a police officer was an act of pure desperation. It was the only card she had left to play. "I'm pregnant." The 2 words fell into the tense salon and seemed to absorb all the sound, even the roar of the storm outside. Julian, who had been turning away, froze mid-stride. He slowly turned back, his face a canvas of disbelief. The officer by the door did not move, but a flicker of something professional curiosity perhaps passed through his eyes. "You're what?" Julian whispered, the sound barely audible. "Pregnant." She repeated the word stronger this time, fueled by a cocktail of fear and defiance. "About 2 months along. I have the doctor's report in my purse as proof. I was going to tell you this weekend. On this trip. I thought it would be perfect." A sob caught in her throat. "I thought you'd be happy." Julian stared at her, his mind struggling to compute this new cataclysmic piece of data. Another pregnancy. Another child. It was impossible. It was a tactical nightmare. And then the cynical, calculating part of his brain took over, dismissing the biological reality and focusing solely on the strategic implication. It was a lie. It had to be. "You're lying," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is a pathetic, desperate Hail Mary to save yourself. You think this makes you a victim in their eyes. You think they'll go easy on the pregnant mistress. It makes you look worse. It makes you look calculating." "I am not lying, Julian," she insisted, hot tears finally spilling down her cheeks, tracing paths through her expensive foundation. "Why would I lie about this? I was scared to tell you. I was scared it would ruin the fantasy, that it would make things too real. But it is real." The Maresciallo finally stepped forward, his presence grounding the hysterical scene in sober reality. "Signorina, Signor Croft, this is not the time or the place." "No!" Sienna shrieked, whirling to face the officer. He needs to hear this. He needs to understand what he has done. He dangles this perfect life in front of me. Promises me the world. He gets me pregnant. And now he wants to throw me away like I'm nothing, because his real wife finally caught up with his lies. Her accusation, raw and visceral, echoed in the salon. It was the ugly, unvarnished truth, stripped of all its charm and romance. Julian stared at her stomach, where a life he had unwittingly created was growing. The news didn't soften him. It didn't spark a flicker of responsibility or compassion. It hardened him. It was just another front in a war. He was losing another messy complication in Annalise's clean, elegant checkmate. He thought of Annalise carrying his heir, the child who would inherit a name he was in the process of destroying. And now Sienna carrying a child who would be born into scandal and shame. The symmetry was almost poetic in its cruelty. A short, sharp, ugly bark of a laugh escaped his lips. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. "Love," he sneered when Sienna whispered that she thought he might love her. "Oh, you poor, stupid girl. Love is a fairy tale for people who can't afford settlements." "This," he said, his arm sweeping to encompass the salon. "The police, the storm raging outside. This is my reality. It's a world of assets and liabilities, and you, my dear, along with your little news, have just become the most significant liability imaginable." The utter cruelty of the statement, the reduction of her and their unborn child to a line item on a balance sheet, finally extinguished the last ember of hope in Sienna's heart. The man she thought she was falling in love with had never existed. He was a phantom, a construct of her own desires. The real man stood before her, and he was a monster. "That is enough," the Maresciallo commanded, his voice sharp with authority. He gestured to his partner. "Escort the Signorina back to her cabin. She is to have no further contact with Signor Croft." Sienna didn't resist. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollow, crushing defeat. She gave Julian one final look, not of love or even sadness, but of pure, crystalline hatred. It was the look of a woman who had seen the devil and had for a time mistaken him for a savior. As she was led away, her shoulders slumped. She was no longer an aspiring star, but just another girl, broken on the wheel of a powerful man's ambition. Julian watched her go, then sank onto the sofa, the fine leather sighing under his weight. He was alone again in the eye of two converging storms. His world was in ruins, betrayed by his wife, abandoned by his mistress, hunted by the law. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of his defeat. He thought of Annalise, her poise, her planning, her quiet, devastating execution. A sliver of something that felt disturbingly like professional admiration cut through his despair. She hadn't just gotten emotional. She had gotten strategic. She had gathered her weapons, chosen her battlefield, and launched an attack so precise it was almost beautiful in its lethality. He, the great Julian Croft, had been outplayed by the art historian he'd relegated to the background of his life. And then as the storm outside reached its crescendo, a new thought began to form in the wreckage of his mind. It was a cold, dark, and venomous thing, but it was also a lifeline. A plan. Sienna's pregnancy. He had called it a liability. But what if it was an asset? His mind, conditioned for years to find leverage in any situation, began to work furiously. He was being painted as a cold, calculating, financial criminal. But what if he could change the narrative? What if he wasn't a criminal, but a man caught in a tragic love triangle? A man whose vindictive, jealous, and emotionally unstable wife had conspired to ruin him at the exact moment he was about to start a new family with the woman he truly loved. He could leak the story. Anonymously, of course. He could frame Annalise's perfectly legal and justified actions as the hysterical revenge of a woman scorned. He could use Sienna's pregnancy as a shield and a sword. It would muddy the waters. It would transform a clear-cut financial investigation into a sordid, messy tabloid spectacle. It would force Annalise to fight not just in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. It might not save him from prison, but it would wound her deeply. It would tarnish her victory and drag her immaculate reputation through the same gutter he now found himself in. A slow, twisted smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It was the first time he had smiled in hours, and it was a horrifying sight. He was cornered, beaten, and facing ruin. But he wasn't dead yet. He had lost his kingdom, his freedom, his fortune. But he had one thing left: his capacity for cruelty. If he was going down, he would burn the whole world to the ground, and he would make sure Annalise was standing in the center of the blaze. The war, he realized with a jolt of adrenaline, was not over. It had just entered a new, far more vicious phase. So the stage is set for an explosive fallout. A powerful man brought to his knees a wife who became a warrior, and a mistress caught in a crossfire she never anticipated. This was the day the bill for a life of lies came due. But is this the end, or just the beginning of a new, dirtier war? What happens when the legal teams descend and the story hits the tabloids? Can Annalise protect her child and her hard-won freedom or will? Julian's desperation dragged her back into the mud with him. A gasp rippled through the gilded ballroom of the St. Regis Hanoi. All eyes were on the woman in crimson. Her hand still raised her face, a mask of triumph. Before her, the gentle, pregnant wife of billionaire mogul Marcus Thorne stumbled a hand protectively, clutching her swollen belly, the imprint of a sapap blooming on her cheek. The city's elite watched breathless as the mistress, bold and unrepentant, declared her victory. But the real drama wasn't the public humiliation or the shattered illusion of a perfect marriage. The true bombshell was nestled deep inside the womb, a secret waiting to be revealed not by words, but by the frantic telling rhythm of a tiny unborn heart. Isabella Thorne believed her life was a fairy tale. At 26, she was the wife of Marcus Thorne, a man whose name was synonymous with power in Southeast Asia's tech scene. Their love story was the stuff of legend, a whirlwind romance that saw a humble art curator marry into one of Hanoi's most influential families. Marcus was her everything charming, attentive, and fiercely protective. He had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, a sprawling penthouse overlooking West Lake, a wardrobe filled with bespoke creations from designers like Kong Tri, and a love that felt as solid as the ancient stones of the nearby Temple of Literature. Now 6 months pregnant with their first child, a son, Isabella felt her world was complete. The nursery was a symphony of soft blues and creams filled with handcrafted toys and imported furniture. Marcus had been ecstatic, hosting lavish dinners to announce the heir to the Thorne empire. He would often rest his hand on her belly, his eyes alight with a joy that seemed to mirror her own. "Our legacy, my love," he'd whisper, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I do for you and for him. But lately, hairline cracks had begun to appear in the flawless facade of their life. Marcus was working later, his phone calls becoming more frequent and hushed. He'd attribute it to a new acquisition, a hostile takeover that required his undivided attention. Isabella, trusting and devoted, accepted his explanations. She'd wait for him, the chef-prepared meals growing cold on the polished mahogany table, her own reflection in the panoramic windows, her only company. The whispers started subtly, a shadow of a rumor caught in the clinking of champagne glasses at charity galas. A name, Camilla, was mentioned in hushed tones by women adorned in diamonds and envy. Isabella ignored them. The high society of Hanoi was a viper's nest of jealousy, and she, the ingenue, who had captured its most eligible bachelor, was the prime target. Camilla, as Isabella would soon learn, was Camilla Tran, a ruthlessly ambitious socialite and a former flame of Marcus's from his university days. While Isabella exuded a quiet, cultured grace, Camilla was a firestorm. Her laughter was loud, her dresses were daring, and her ambition was an open secret. She had recently returned to Hanoi after a stint in Singapore, and her re-entry into their circle was as subtle as a lightning strike. The first time Isabella felt a genuine pang of unease was at the annual Vietnam Innovators Gala, held at the opulent St. Regis Hanoi. Marcus, who was receiving the top award, was uncharacteristically distracted all evening. His eyes kept flitting towards the entrance, his grip on her hand just a fraction too tight. And then Camilla had arrived. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin. A stark, audacious slash of color in a sea of elegant pastels and classic blacks. She moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a panther, her gaze locking onto Marcus across the ballroom. Isabella saw the flicker of something in her husband's eyes. Not just recognition, but something deeper, more complicated. A ghost of a memory, a shared history that excluded her. Throughout the night she watched as Camilla artfully cornered Marcus, her hand lingering on his arm, her laughter echoing a little too loudly in their conversations. Marcus, for his part, seemed flustered, a state so alien to his usual composed demeanor that it set Isabella's nerves on edge. "She's just an old friend, darling," he had reassured her later that night, his voice smooth as silk. A bit intense but harmless. He had pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers, and for a moment the warmth of his embrace melted her fears. She wanted to believe him. To doubt Marcus was to doubt the very foundation of her world. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. A week later, a receipt for a lavish bouquet of black roses, a flower Isabella detested but knew was Camilla's favorite, fell out of his briefcase. He'd brushed it off as a corporate gift. Then there was the late-night text that buzzed on his phone, a simple "thinking of you" from a number he quickly deleted. The excuses became more elaborate, the distance between them growing from a hairline crack to a chasm. Isabella felt a profound and suffocating loneliness. The sprawling penthouse, once a symbol of her fairy tale life, now felt like a gilded cage. Her friends, mostly wives of Marcus's business associates, offered sympathetic but ultimately hollow words. They were part of this world. They understood its unspoken rules, the silent accommodations, the turning of a blind eye. But Isabella's heart, pure and perhaps a little naive, couldn't accept that. Love to her was not a transaction or an arrangement. It was a sacred, all-consuming truth. The pregnancy, once her greatest joy, now became a source of anxiety. She felt a desperate need to protect her unborn son, not just from the world, but from the encroaching shadows in her own home. She tried to talk to Marcus to break through the wall he was meticulously building around himself. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" she asked one evening, her hand on his arm as he stared out at the city lights. You seem so far away. He turned his face a carefully constructed mask of affection. Just stress, my love. This deal is draining. Once it's over, it'll be just the three of us. I promise. He tilted her chin up and kissed her a perfunctory gesture that no longer reached his eyes. Isabella knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he was lying. The deal wasn't about business. The hostile takeover was happening right under her roof, and the enemy was not a rival corporation, but a woman in a crimson dress who smelled of black roses and broken promises. The fairy tale was over. Isabella was trapped, pregnant, and alone, standing on the precipice of a devastating truth, with no idea just how brutal the revelation would be. The breaking point arrived with an embossed, cream-colored invitation. The Thorn Corporation was celebrating its 50th anniversary with a grand ball. It was to be the social event of the season, a testament to the family's enduring legacy and power. For Isabella, it felt less like a celebration and more like a stage for the final act of her disintegrating marriage. In the weeks leading up to the event, Marcus was a whirlwind of activity, but his focus was sharp, his mood almost buoyant. He presented Isabella with a stunning midnight blue gown by a Parisian couturier and a sapphire necklace that mirrored the depths of West Lake. "You will be the most beautiful woman there," he said, his voice brimming with a sincerity she hadn't heard in months. "The mother of my son, the queen of my heart." For a fleeting, hopeful moment, Isabella allowed herself to believe him. Perhaps the affair, the whispers, the lies, had been a fleeting madness. Perhaps this night was his way of reaffirming their bond, of showing the world, and her, that she was the one who truly mattered. She pushed her anxieties down, focusing on the baby's gentle kicks, a secret language of reassurance between mother and child. The night of the ballroom of the St. Regis Hanoi, was transformed into an enchanted forest from a Vietnamese folk tale. Thousands of orchids cascaded from the ceilings, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the low hum of high-powered conversations. Isabella on Marcus's arm was a vision of serene elegance. The deep blue of her gown complemented her pregnancy, and the thorn sapphires at her throat glittered with every turn of her head. She smiled. She mingled. She played the part of the perfect billionaire's wife, all while a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She knew Camilla would be there. It was inevitable. And sure enough, she saw her holding court by the champagne fountain, not in her usual audacious red, but in a startlingly white, almost bridal gown. The dress was a deliberate, provocative choice, an open challenge. Camilla's eyes found Isabella's across the room, and she offered a slow, deliberate smile that was anything but friendly. Marcus stiffened beside her. "Ignore her," he murmured, his grip on her elbow becoming possessive. "Tonight is about us." But Camilla had no intention of being ignored. As the night wore on, she seemed to be everywhere Isabella was. If Isabella moved to the terrace for a breath of fresh air, Camilla would appear moments later, her laughter sharp and piercing. If Isabella paused to speak with an acquaintance, Camilla would glide past her perfume, the cloying scent of black roses, leaving a toxic trail. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, and it was working. Isabella's composure began to fray. The climax came just after the main speeches. Marcus had just delivered a moving tribute to his family and the future of his company, concluding with a toast to my beautiful wife, Isabella, and our son, who will one day lead this legacy. The room erupted in applause. Beaming Marcus turned to kiss her, a public display of affection designed to cement their image as the perfect couple. It was in that moment of manufactured bliss that Camilla made her move. She strode towards their central table, her white dress parting the sea of guests like the prow of a ship. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in her eyes. The murmuring of the crowd died down as she approached a collective intake of breath, creating a vacuum of silence in the grand ballroom. She stopped directly in front of Isabella, who was still seated. Marcus, caught off guard, stood halfway, his smile frozen on his face. Legacy. Camilla's voice was clear and cold, slicing through the silence. Your son. She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Marcus, you are a wonderful storyteller, but you seem to have forgotten the main character. She turned her venomous gaze on Isabella. You poor, pathetic little thing. Did you really believe all of it? The love story. The happy family. Isabella, stunned into silence, could only stare up at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What are you talking about? She whispered, her voice barely audible. What am I talking about? Camilla's voice rose, theatrical and cruel. I'm talking about the fact that the child you are carrying is not the only Thorn heir. I'm talking about the fact that Marcus has been with me in my bed every night he told you he was working late. Gasps rippled through the room. People were now openly staring their phones, discreetly raised to capture the unfolding drama. Marcus finally found his voice. Camilla, that's enough. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene, she shrieked, her composure finally cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. You're the one who has been living a lie. You promised me, Marcus. You promised you would leave her. She then looked back at Isabella, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of pity and contempt. He was never going to leave me. This, she gestured at Isabella's belly, was just a little complication, an air for the public. But his heart, his passion, that belongs to me. Isabella felt the world tilt on its axis. The faces of the guests blurred into a grotesque gallery of gawking masks. She looked at Marcus silently, pleading with him to deny it, to say something to defend her. But he stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting between the two women, a trapped animal. His silence was the only confession she needed. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, hot and shameful. She felt a protective instinct surge through her, a primal need to shield her son from this ugliness. She tried to stand to escape the suffocating scrutiny. Please, stop, she managed to say. But Camilla was not finished. She saw the tears, the vulnerability, and she went in for the kill. You think you've won? You think this baby solidifies your position? You are nothing but an incubator, a vessel. And then, with a movement so swift it seemed to surprise even herself, Camilla leaned forward and swung her arm. Crack! The sound was sharp and shockingly loud in the silent room. Isabella's head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending a jolt through her entire body. A collective horrified gasp erupted from the onlookers. For a moment, there was only the stinging heat on her cheek and the stunned realization of what had just happened. Camilla the Mistress had slapped the pregnant wife of Marcus Thorn in front of everyone. Isabella stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, but her other arm wrapped instinctively desperately around her stomach. The humiliation was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. She looked at the faces around her, the shock, the pity, the morbid curiosity. She looked at Marcus, whose face was a canvas of horror and indecision, and then she looked at Camilla, who stood there, her chest heaving, her hand still tingling, a triumphant, hateful glare in her eyes. The fairy tale had not just ended. It had been violently, publicly, and irrevocably shattered. And as a sharp, cramping pain shot through her abdomen, Isabella realized the slap was not the most painful blow she would receive that night. The real agony was just beginning. The slap echoed in the cavernous ballroom, a definitive brutal end to the night's festivities. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic tableau of shock and confusion. For a heartbeat, everyone, including Marcus, seemed frozen. Then the world lurched back into motion. Isabella, her mind reeling from the dual assault of humiliation and physical pain, felt her knees buckle. The sharp cramp in her lower abdomen intensified, radiating outwards in a wave of pure agony. A small, involuntary soul escaped her lips. "My baby," she whispered, her voice choked with terror. Her protective instinct overrode everything else. The shame, the anger, the betrayal. All that mattered was the tiny, precious life inside her. It was not her husband who caught her. It was his father, Arthur Thorne, the family patriarch, who had been watching from a nearby table with an expression of grim fury. He surged forward, his old but still powerful frame moving with surprising speed, catching Isabella's arm just as she was about to collapse. "Get her a chair! Someone call a doctor!" he bellowed, his voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms cutting through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. Marcus finally snapped out of his paralysis. "Isabella." He rushed to her side, his face a mess of panic and guilt. "My God, are you all right?" He reached for her, but she flinched away. Her eyes filled with more pain than he had ever seen meeting his. In that single searing glance, he saw the complete and utter destruction of her trust in him. Camilla, meanwhile, seemed to realize the enormity of her actions. The triumphant fire in her eyes flickered, replaced by a flicker of panic. Assaulting anyone in this public manner was scandalous. Striking a pregnant woman was a cardinal sin, even in the morally flexible world of the super-rich. She took a half-step back, her gaze darting towards the exits. She had intended to cause a scene to force Marcus's hand, but this was spiraling out of control. I didn't mean," she began, but her words were cut off by Arthur Thorne's glacial stare. "You," he said, his voice low and lethally soft, "will not move an inch." Security. Two imposing men in dark suits materialized at his side. "Escort Ms. Tran to a private room, and do not let her leave." Camilla's face paled. She opened her mouth to protest, but one look at the unyielding fury in Arthur's eyes silenced her. Without another word, the guards flanked her and guided her away, her white dress now looking less like a bridal gown and more like a shroud. All focus was now on Isabella. She was gasping, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged pants. The cramping was getting worse. "It hurts," she cried, clutching her belly as if she could physically hold her son in place. "Marcus, it hurts." Despite her flinching away, her fear-driven instinct was to call out to the man she still on some level saw as her protector. Marcus, his face ashen, knelt before her. "I'm here, Isabella. I'm so sorry. We'll get you to the hospital." He tried to take her hand, and this time she let him, her fingers gripping his with a desperate strength. The St. Regis staff, trained for any contingency, moved with quiet efficiency. A makeshift screen was erected around the table, affording the Thorns a sliver of privacy from the hundreds of prying eyes. A medic who was on standby for the event was at Isabella's side, in moments taking her pulse, his face grim. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. She's cramping. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." "The FV hospital is the closest with a top-tier maternity ward," the medic announced, referring to the well-regarded Franco-Vietnamese hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, which had a prestigious branch in Hanoi. The logistics of the escape were a blur to Isabella. She was vaguely aware of being transferred to a wheelchair, of being wheeled through service corridors and down a private elevator away from the whispers and the stairs. The journey was a torment of pain and fear. Every bump in the road sent a fresh wave of agony through her. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, her hand never leaving her belly, whispering her son's name, a mantra against the encroaching darkness. Marcus sat beside her in the back of his Maybach, a silent, tormented figure. The mask of the powerful CEO was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man watching his world crumble due to his own weakness. He kept murmuring apologies, a litany of "I'm sorry, Isabella. I never wanted this. Please be okay." Isabella didn't respond. His words were meaningless static, the buzzing of a fly in a hurricane. The man whose promises had built her world had just stood by and watched it be demolished. His apologies were not for her. They were for himself. They were the desperate pleas of a guilty man trying to absolve himself, and she had no comfort to offer him. She felt a terrifying wetness between her legs, and a fresh surge of panic rose in her throat. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her eyes flying open and locking with his. "Marcus, something is wrong with the baby." The terror in her voice finally seemed to penetrate his self-pity. He barked at his driver. "Faster. For God's sake, drive faster." As the limousine sped through the glittering, indifferent streets of Hanoi, leaving the scene of her humiliation, far behind, Isabella felt a strange and chilling calm settle over her. The physical pain was immense, but it was the emotional agony that was truly defining. The slap had been a catalyst, a violent act that had shattered the gilded cage. But what echoed in its wake was not just the sound of a hand hitting skin, but the deafening silence of her husband's betrayal. It was the echo of a lie she had been living, a lie that was now threatening to cost her the only thing that mattered. She was no longer just fighting for her marriage or her dignity. She was fighting for her son's life. The emergency entrance of the FV hospital was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and urgent controlled chaos. A team was waiting, alerted by Arthur Thorne's influential call. Isabella was swiftly transferred from the wheelchair to a gurney, the transition jarring her body and eliciting another cry of pain. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, their voices a calm but urgent flurry of medical terminology. Pregnant, 26 weeks, presenting with severe abdominal cramping and signs of bleeding following a physical altercation. BP is 160/100. Tachycardic. Get her to the maternity ward, stat prep for an ultrasound. We need to check for placental abruption. Marcus was shunted to the side, rendered powerless and irrelevant by the medical professionals who now held his wife's and child's lives in their hands. He stood in the corridor, his tuxedo looking absurdly out of place, his hands stained with a small amount of Isabella's blood where he had tried to comfort her. He watched as they wheeled her away, her hand still protectively on her belly, her face pale and etched with fear. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his guilt. Inside the examination room, The atmosphere was tense. Isabella was gently helped into a hospital gown, her beautiful midnight blue dress unceremoniously cut away. The pain was a constant, terrifying rhythm. A kind-faced, middle-aged female doctor, Dr. Lian, introduced herself as the head of obstetrics. Isabella, my name is Dr. Lian. We're going to take very good care of you and your baby, she said, her voice a beacon of calm in the storm. We need to do an ultrasound to see what's happening. I need you to try and stay as still as possible. Isabella nodded, tears streaming silently down her temples. Is my baby going to be okay? We're doing everything we can to ensure that, Dr. Lian said, her reassuring tone never wavering, though her eyes betrayed the seriousness of the situation. Let's have a look. The room fell silent as the ultrasound technician applied the cold gel to Isabella's stomach. All that could be heard was the soft whirring of the machine and Isabella's ragged breathing. She stared at the monitor, her heart pounding in her ears, praying for a sign, for a flicker of hope. The technician moved the transducer across her abdomen, the grey and black images swirling on the screen. Dr. Lien's eyes were narrowed in concentration. Her brow furrowed. Marcus, who had finally been allowed in after an agonizing wait, stood in the corner, looking on helplessly. There's the baby, Dr. Lien said softly. He's small, but he's a fighter. Isabella let out a choked sob of relief. He was alive. But I am seeing some cause for concern. The doctor continued, her tone becoming more clinical. There appears to be a small subchorionic hematoma, likely caused by the trauma and the spike in your blood pressure. It's a bleed. That's what's causing the pain and the spotting. We need to monitor it very closely. But he'll be okay. Marcus's voice was hoarse from the sidelines. Dr. Lian didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on her patient. The immediate danger is preterm labor. The stress and physical shock could trigger contractions. We're going to give you medication to stop them and a steroid shot to help the baby's lungs develop just in case. As she spoke, the technician adjusted a setting on the machine, and a new sound filled the room. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of the baby's heartbeat, amplified by the machine. It was fast, a frantic, galloping rhythm, but it was strong. It was the most beautiful sound Isabella had ever heard. Tears of relief streamed down her face. It was the sound of life, of hope. Dr. Lien smiled for the first time. A strong heartbeat. That's a very good sign. A little fast, he's clearly stressed, but strong. Marcus stepped forward, a wave of relief washing over his face. Thank God, he breathed. The technician continued her work, taking measurements, capturing stills of the tiny profile, the little fists. Dr. Lian was explaining the course of treatment, complete bed rest, constant monitoring, when the technician suddenly paused. She zoomed in on one particular area of the screen, her own brow furrowing in a way that had nothing to do with the hematoma. Doctor, she said quietly, pointing to the screen. Could you look at this? Dr. Lian leaned in, her professional gaze sweeping over the area the technician indicated. The room fell silent again. The baby's amplified heartbeat, the only sound. For a long moment, Dr. Lien said nothing. She simply stared at the image, her expression shifting from professional concern to one of utter bewilderment. What is it? Isabella asked, a fresh spike of fear piercing her relief. Is something else wrong? Dr. Lien turned from the monitor and looked at Isabella, then at Marcus, and then back to Isabella. Her face was a complex mask of confusion and something else, something that looked like disbelief. "Run the Doppler again," she instructed the technician. "Amplify it." The technician complied. The thump-thump sound filled the room once more. But this time the technician moved the transducer just a few centimeters, and then another sound joined the first. Thump-thump, 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 thump-thump. It was a second heartbeat, distinct, separate, yet beating in an almost identical, frantic rhythm. It was unmistakable. The room, which had been filled with one frantic heartbeat, was now filled with the sound of two. Isabella stared at the screen, then at the doctor, her mind unable to process the sound. "What is that?" Marcus stepped closer to the screen, his eyes wide with confusion. "Is that an echo? What's wrong with the machine?" Dr. Lyon slowly shook her head, her eyes still locked on the monitor, where two tiny, flickering forms were now visible. She looked up at Isabella, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Thorne, there is nothing wrong with the machine." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself to announce something utterly impossible. "Isabella, you're not carrying one baby." She pointed a trembling finger at the screen, at the two distinct sacs, at the two tiny, flickering hearts, beating in terrified unison. "You're having twins." The revelation hung in the air, a fact so stunning, so completely unexpected, that it defied all logic. All the previous scans conducted by a top society doctor chosen by Marcus had shown only one baby. One boy. The heir. Marcus had been there every time, beaming as he looked at the grainy image of his son. A wave of dizziness washed over Isabella. Twins. How was that possible? They had done scans at 8 weeks, 12 weeks and the detailed anatomy scan at 20 weeks. All had shown one baby, a single, healthy boy. Then a darker, more insidious thought began to form in the recesses of her mind, born from the night's catastrophic betrayals. She looked at Marcus, whose face was not filled with the joy of an unexpected blessing, but with a ghostly pallor of pure, unadulterated shock. His expression was not one of confusion. It was the look of a man whose carefully constructed lie had just been blown apart by the most undeniable, most irrefutable truth of all. The society doctor, the man he had chosen, the insistence on it being a boy, the unwavering certainty. But all the other scans? She began, her voice trembling as the horrifying implication began to dawn on her. Dr. Pham always said. He said it was just one. Marcus couldn't meet her gaze. He stared at the screen at the two heartbeats that had just exposed him, his mind clearly racing, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And in that moment, Isabella understood. The slap the affair, the public humiliation that was just the prelude. This was the true betrayal. It wasn't just a simple case of infidelity. It was a deception so profound, so calculated, that it had targeted the most sacred space in her life, her own body, her own children. Dr. Lien, sensing the monumental shift in the room, spoke gently. Sometimes a twin can be hidden, tucked behind the other, especially if the sonographer isn't specifically looking. But at 26 weeks, it's unusual to miss. Very unusual. Her carefully chosen words hung in the air, a quiet indictment. The two heartbeats continued their frantic rhythmic drumming, a sound that was no longer just a sign of life, but a declaration of war. They were the beat of a truth that could not be silenced, a truth that revealed that Marcus Thorne had not just lied about his mistress. He had lied about the very nature of the legacy he claimed to cherish. Isabella was not just carrying his heir. She was carrying a secret he had desperately, and for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, tried to conceal. And now, thanks to the violent act of his mistress, that secret was out. Everything had changed. The revelation of the second heartbeat did not bring joy. It detonated in the sterile hospital room like a silent, devastating bomb, obliterating the last vestiges of Isabella's shattered reality. The sound of the two tiny hearts beating in unison was a testament not to a miracle, but to a monstrous, calculated deception. Isabella lay on the hospital bed, the doctor's words echoing in her ears. "You're having twins." She looked at Marcus, truly looked at him for the first time since the news broke. The panic on his face was undeniable, but it was laced with something else. The cold, hard glint of a man cornered. It was the look of a king whose carefully constructed kingdom had just been set ablaze. "You knew," she whispered, her voice devoid of tears, stripped bare to a chilling monotone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a verdict. "You knew, and you lied." Marcus flinched, as if she had slapped him. "Isabella, no, how could I have known? It's a surprise, a blessing." His attempt at feigned delight was pathetic, a transparently false performance that was an insult to her intelligence. "A blessing." Her voice rose, laced with a hysterical edge. "You stood there at every appointment with Dr. Pham, your hand-picked physician, looking at the screen and telling me about our son, the Thorn heir. Was he in on it too? Did you pay him to lie to erase one of our children from existence?" The accusation hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Dr. Lyon and the technician suddenly became very busy, averting their eyes, offering the illusion of privacy where none existed. "That's a crazy accusation," Marcus stammered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time all night. "Why would I do that? Why would I hide one of my own children? I don't know." Isabella's voice cracked, the raw pain finally breaking through her shock. "Maybe one was a boy and one was a girl, and you only wanted the boy. Maybe you have some sick, twisted reason. I can't even begin to imagine. But you knew. Your shock wasn't surprise, Marcus. It was the terror of being caught." The two heartbeats, still thumping steadily from the monitor, served as a relentless, rhythmic jury. Thump, 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 thump. Guilty. Guilty. Before Marcus could formulate another lie, the door opened and his father, Arthur Thorne, swept in. The patriarch's face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. He had clearly been briefed. He took in the scene, Isabella pale and trembling with fury on the bed, Marcus cornered and sweating, the damning image still frozen on the ultrasound screen. Arthur's gaze fell on his son, and the disappointment in his eyes was so profound it was almost a physical force. "I have just had a very enlightening conversation with the hospital administrator," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And I took the liberty of placing a call to your Dr. Pham. A very nervous man, Dr. Pham. It seems his records from your last scan have been misplaced." Marcus visibly paled. The unspoken threat was clear. The Thorne family's reach was long, and a doctor who participated in such a fraud would have his career destroyed. "Father, this is a misunderstanding." Marcus began, his voice pleading. "Silence," Arthur commanded, and Marcus, for all his billions and his power, obeyed like a chastened child. Arthur walked to Isabella's bedside, His expression softened as he looked at her, a flicker of genuine compassion in his hardened eyes. "Isabella," he said gently, "I am profoundly sorry for the humiliation you suffered tonight and for this unforgivable deception. Whatever my son has done, the Thorne family will not abandon you or your children." He glanced at the monitor, a flicker of wonder crossing his face at the sight of the two distinct forms, two potential heirs. He then turned his full attention back to Marcus, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You will tell me why. You will tell me why you would deny your own blood." Now. Trapped between his furious father and his devastated wife, Marcus finally broke. The lies, the bravado, the carefully maintained facade. It all crumbled. He slumped into the chair in the corner, his head in his hands. "It was complicated," he mumbled. "Complicated does not suffice when you are lying to your wife about the existence of your child," Arthur thundered. Marcus looked up his face, a mask of desperation. "It was Camilla," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She's pregnant too." The air was sucked out of the room. Isabella felt a fresh wave of nausea so intense she thought she would be sick. It was a betrayal on a scale she could never have conceived. "I found out a few months ago," Marcus continued the confession, tumbling out of him in a torrent of self-pitying misery. "She claimed it was mine. She threatened to go public to ruin everything. The anniversary, the launch of the new subsidiary. The timing was a disaster. She wanted me to leave you to marry her. She was obsessed. And your solution was to lie to everyone Arthur demanded." "I was buying time," Marcus insisted, standing up, pacing like a caged animal. "I didn't know if her baby was even mine. I told her I'd handle it. My plan, my stupid, idiotic plan, was to secure the legitimate heir. Our son." He looked at Isabella. "I needed to establish his primacy. A single male heir. It was clean, powerful. It would cement our family line and make Camilla's claim if she made it seem like a desperate, pathetic ploy from a scorned mistress." The chilling logic of his plan began to dawn on Isabella. And a second baby, a twin, complicated, that she said, her voice hollow. It muddied the waters, he exclaimed, almost angry that she was making him admit it. 2 babies. It made it seem messy, less definitive. And what if one was a girl? It would weaken my position. I told Farm to just focus on the boy, to omit the other one from the official reports, just for a little while. I was going to reveal the surprise twin later after Camilla's situation was neutralized. I swear it, Isabella. I would never have denied our child forever. It was a temporary, strategic deception. A strategic deception. Isabella repeated the words, tasting their poison. You erased our child from our lives for strategy. You made me believe I was only carrying one baby, grieving a loss. I didn't even know I had all to manage your sordid affair. The sheer cold-blooded calculus of it was breathtaking. He had weighed his children on a scale of public relations and corporate strategy and found one of them wanting. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had played God with their unborn children. Arthur Thorne looked at his son with utter contempt. You are a fool, Marcus. A weak, short-sighted fool. You have taken a crisis and turned it into a cataclysm. You have dishonored your wife, your name, and your own unborn children, all to appease a venomous viper you were too weak to discard. He turned back to Isabella, his decision made. Isabella, you will want for nothing. The full resources of the Thorne family are at your disposal. You and your children will be protected. As for you, Marcus, he said, his voice dropping to absolute zero, you are relieved of all your duties at Thorn Corporation, effective immediately. Your assets are frozen. You will go to the country house, and you will not leave until I summon you. You have made your bed of lies. Now you will lie in it, alone. The verdict was absolute. In the space of a few hours, Marcus Thorn had gone from the king of Hanoi's business world to a dethroned, disgraced exile. He stared at his father, then at his wife, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. There was nothing left to say. His lies had unraveled, and in doing so had unraveled him completely. Isabella watched him, feeling not a shred of pity, only a vast, empty coldness, where her love used to be. The man she had married was a stranger, a moral void, hidden behind a handsome face and a charming mouth. The trauma of the night, the slap the terror had forged something new inside her. The meek, trusting art curator was gone. In her place was a mother of two, a woman who had been pushed to the absolute limit and had found not an abyss but a core of steel. The two heartbeats on the monitor continued their steady, strong rhythm. They were the only truth left in the room. They were her truth. And she would protect them and herself with a ferocity that Marcus and his mistress could not possibly comprehend. The war was just beginning. The week that followed was a cocoon of enforced tranquility and simmering rage. Isabella remained at the FV hospital not just for medical reasons, but for sanctuary. Her suite was transformed into a command center, a fortress from which she would plan her counter-offensive. The hematoma was stable, the risk of preterm labor had subsided, and the two tiny heartbeats that had upended her world grew stronger each day. They were her fuel, her purpose. Arthur Thorn was true to his word. He visited daily, not with the overbearing authority of a patriarch, but with the quiet deference of an ally. He saw in Isabella not a fragile victim, but the future matriarch of his legacy, the guardian of not one but two of his grandchildren. He provided her with the best legal team in Vietnam, a group of sharp, merciless lawyers who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Spare no expense, Arthur had told them in Isabella's presence. I want this handled with the subtlety of a guillotine, clean, final, and entirely in Ms. Isabella's favor. Marcus was gone, banished to a remote Thorn estate in the highlands of Darlat. His name was scrubbed from the corporate website his office cleared out. The official story, meticulously crafted by Arthur's PR team, was that Marcus had stepped down for personal health reasons to focus on his family during a difficult pregnancy. The story was just plausible enough to quell the rampant speculation. But the real story, the one whispered in the boardrooms and elite social circles, was that the king had been ruthlessly deposed. Camilla Tran was also dealt with. Arthur's investigators had worked with surgical precision. They uncovered her own web of debts and deceit. The pregnancy, she claimed, it was real. But a discreetly obtained DNA test from a coffee cup she'd used at a cafe proved what Arthur had suspected. The baby wasn't Marcus's. It belonged to a married Singaporean businessman she had been seeing concurrently. Armed with this proof, Arthur's lawyers presented her with a simple, non-negotiable choice: disappear quietly, with a modest one-time settlement and a signed NDA, or face public exposure fraud charges and the unmitigated wrath of the Thorn family. Camilla, a pragmatist above all else, took the deal and vanished from the Hanoi social scene as quickly as she had appeared. But for Isabella, these victories were peripheral. Her focus was singular. It wasn't about revenge on Camilla, or even about punishing Marcus anymore. It was about reclaiming her narrative and securing an unassailable future for her children. During her days in the hospital, she began to change. The soft, deferential woman who had once organized art exhibitions was replaced by a shrewd, calculating strategist. She devoured the financial reports her lawyers brought her, learning about trust funds, share allocations, and corporate governance. She had once loved Marcus for his charm and ambition. Now she studied the architecture of the empire he had built, not with admiration, but with the critical eye of a conqueror. Her gambit when she finally revealed it to her lawyers and a stunned but impressed Arthur Thorne was audacious. "I don't want a simple divorce settlement," she announced one afternoon, her voice clear and steady. The hospital suite was bathed in the soft afternoon light, and she was propped up in bed, surrounded by financial documents looking more like a CEO than a patient. "I don't want cash or property or alimony." Her lead lawyer, a formidable woman named Ms. Vi, raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Isabella, given the circumstances, the infidelity, the public assault, the staggering fraud regarding the children, you are entitled to one of the largest settlements in this country's history. A settlement makes me a pensioner of the Thorne family," Isabella stated calmly. "It makes me a wealthy victim. I have no interest in being a victim." She looked directly at Arthur. "Marcus's shares in Thorne Corporation, his voting rights, his seat on the board. I want them transferred to a trust that I control as the sole trustee for the benefit of my children." Arthur stared at her, his expression unreadable. Ms. Vi's jaw practically dropped. Isabella was not asking for a piece of the pie. She was demanding control of the bakery. "He will never agree to that," Miss Vi said. "That's his identity, his life's work." "He will agree," Isabella said, with chilling certainty, "because the alternative is that I don't sign a non-disclosure agreement. The alternative is that I give a full, exclusive interview to the Wall Street Journal. I will tell them everything about the affair, about the public assault by his mistress, and about the meticulous medically assisted fraud he perpetrated to hide the existence of one of his own children for strategic gain." She let the threat hang in the air. It was mutually assured destruction. The scandal would not just destroy Marcus's reputation permanently. It would taint the Thorne Corporation name for a generation. It would cause shareholder panic, invite regulatory scrutiny, and become a legendary case study in corporate malfeasance and moral bankruptcy. I will detail how Dr. Pham was pressured to falsify medical records. She continued, her eyes locked on Arthur. I will explain that my husband's immediate reaction to discovering he was having twins was not joy, but terror at his lie being exposed. I will paint a picture of a man and a corporate culture so obsessed with a clean, powerful narrative of a single male heir that it was willing to deny a child's very existence. Arthur remained silent, his steepled fingers covering his mouth. He was a ruthless businessman, and he recognized the move for what it was, a brilliant, perfectly executed checkmate. Isabella had found his single greatest weakness, his obsession with the family legacy. She was using the sanctity of that legacy which Marcus had so carelessly desecrated as her ultimate weapon. She wasn't threatening to take his money. She was threatening to burn his kingdom to the ground. Finally, he spoke, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. "He'll sign," Arthur said, nodding to Ms. Vi. "Draw up the papers." The meeting with Marcus was arranged a week later, after Isabella was discharged and settled into a new, secure penthouse, one chosen and paid for by her from an advance on the trust. The location was neutral, a private conference room at the Sofitel Legend Metropole Hanoi, a place of old-world power. Isabella walked in not as a victim, but as an equal. She was no longer pregnant and hiding behind flowing dresses. She had given birth 2 days prior to 2 small but healthy babies, a boy Leo and a girl Luna. The birth had been premature but uncomplicated. Her body was tired, but her spirit was forged in iron. Marcus was already there, flanked by his own lawyer. He looked diminished, a ghost of his former self. The tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He hadn't seen Isabella or his children since the night at the hospital. He stood when she entered. "Isabella, I heard about the babies. Are they?" "They are fine," she said, her voice cool and professional, cutting him off. She did not take the offered seat across from him, but remained standing, a silent assertion of power. "No thanks to you." She gestured for Ms. Vi to present the documents. Marcus's lawyer read through them, his eyes widening with each clause. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his client. Marcus just shook his head, a broken man. This is everything," he whispered, looking at Isabella. "My shares, my seat, my entire life." "You have a life," Isabella retorted, her voice sharp as glass. "You have one because I am choosing not to scorch the earth. I am choosing to protect the family name for the sake of my children. This is not a punishment, Marcus. It is a consequence. You proved you are not fit to be the steward of this legacy. So now I will be." She finally sat down, her gaze unwavering. "You will have supervised visitation rights. You will be provided with a generous allowance, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to cause trouble. You will, for all intents and purposes, retire from public life. In return, the world will remember you as the man who stepped down for his family. It's a better legacy than the one you were building. You should thank me." There was a long, heavy silence. Marcus looked at the documents, then at his ex-wife, the woman he had so grievously underestimated. He saw not the gentle girl he had married, but an empress in the making. He had created her, in a way. His betrayals had been the fire, and she had walked out of it reborn, holding his entire world in her hands. With a trembling hand, Marcus Thorne, the deposed king, picked up the pen. He signed away his power, his company, and his future, all to the steady, silent rhythm of 2 tiny heartbeats he had once tried to erase. The Empress's gambit had succeeded, and so the story of the slap that shocked Hanoi's elite took its final stunning turn. It was never just about a mistress's fury or a husband's infidelity. It was about a deception that ran to the very heart of a family and the quiet, unassuming wife who rose from the ashes of public humiliation to seize control of an empire. Isabella Thorne, once a footnote in her husband's story, became the author of her own rewriting her destiny, not with tears, but with shrewd intelligence and the unyielding power of a mother's love. She proved that the greatest strength is often forged in the deepest betrayal, and that sometimes the most powerful move is not to destroy your enemies, but to simply take everything they hold dear. What did you think of Isabella's ultimate power move? Was it justice or the most brilliant revenge? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.